What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through why most founders ignore operations until it's too late. And this video is going to be a super fun one. I've wanted to chat about this for a very long time, and today we're diving deep into it, so I'm super excited. So like always with these videos, the main mission is to show how builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that I'm actively implementing in terms of mental models and how we're scaling those mental models into the future, and also just to solve what hurts within businesses and organizations, basically to come in and be the chief problem solvers and ultimately build back-end infrastructure while we're at it. And also just call in visionaries, basically people that are aligned with what it is that we're actively striving to solve for, which is chaos, and ultimately just to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So operations, one of those things that within your business you ultimately do need, and this is one I feel should be taken priority of, and it has a lot of value into the long term run. And this is why most founders build like the world isn't gonna break. I believe, I've seen this pattern of a lot of founders just building as if the world is not going to break, but unfortunately it is. And they do this through chasing sales, raising money, and shipping features, and ultimately through that they leave operations to chance. So LTV, how much they're bringing in, how they're tracking all those numbers, they ultimately just leave those factors to chance. And it works for sure. It 100% works. I've seen it work that businesses get up to 100k, like without any operations. They just brute force it, and of course it works. But there's the thing where it works until one thing breaks, and that one thing could be a client cancels, a key hire leaves, or the system collapses, and now the business is on fire simply because they don't have the back-end operations infrastructure set up. They ultimately burn simply because of that. And I think early stages, I think the investment into just sorting out those back-end infrastructure leaks is ultimately super important, and that is why I think back-end operations is part of the best modes in order to build and reshape the industry and the future as well. But here's the problem. Here's the real core problem. Most people solve for growth. I'm solving for resilience. They ask, hey, how do I scale this? But I'm rather taking a different approach, which is asking the questions of what happens if this breaks? Would it kill this business tomorrow if I stopped showing up? And also, how can I fix this now and not later? Basically asking the questions of, let's not focus on growth, or let's say, hey, the simple question that we could ask through this is, how can we focus on growth? But what if that growth comes from stopping what is stopping you from growth, which ultimately leads you to that 10x growth? And I've spoken to a lot of people in the space that have ultimately shared this common opinion that growth happens through stopping the things that have happened. They've experienced exponential growth through stopping what has stopped them to growth, whether it's just simply just tracking numbers, tracking how much they're making within their internal infrastructure. I think just ultimately taking that and super dialing that in ultimately allowed them to then 10x what they were doing. And I think just asking those questions of, hey, what happens if this breaks while I'm scaling, ultimately allows you to say, hey, okay, we're not tracking our LTVs, we're not tracking our, how much we're spending in ad spend, our AOVs. How are we actually keeping track of those things? We have no understanding of the data. And ultimately, how can you expect to scale to the heights that you want to scale to within your business if you don't have those numbers set up, and you also don't have, strategies and the framework or even infrastructure set up for that? And that's what we're basically, taking a look into, because operations ultimately is the lifeblood, and that infrastructure layer of the business is ultimately what governs the success, at least from my opinion, and the way that I've been able to scope out this landscape and saying, hey, what would kill this business tomorrow if it stopped showing up? Asking, hey, if this stops showing up, what would kill the business tomorrow? Is it simply just their internal infrastructure? Do they have tracking in terms of their teams? How much, the team is actually getting done? Do they have measures in place to track that as well? And ultimately saying, hey, how can I fix that now and not later? Which ultimately, focuses on this concept of inversion thinking. So basically, not optimizing for the wins, but basically planning against the losses most founders don't see coming. And I think for me, one of the most important things that I am super bullish on, and just me as a person, is I always think of what is the worst case scenario, what are the things that could go wrong, and then actively just solve and plan for those, so that if it does happen, you ultimately not surprised. And through, just ultimately understanding the infrastructure layer as well, you ultimately are able to cater for that by saying, hey, if this infrastructure layer breaks tomorrow, would this business still continue? If the answer is no, then ultimately you understand that, hey, we need to make sure that we're actively, we most of the time it's yes, sorry, but ultimately we need to make sure that we're understanding that, hey, this infrastructure layer is one of the key things that is the lifeblood of this business. So we need to make sure that it is running each and every single day. What could go wrong? We note it down, and then we actively just plan for it. But through this, it also leads to blind spots where ops is invisible until it fails. So you have this bystander effect where you sit essentially, for example, I think Blake Scholes summed this up pretty perfectly, that hey, if you're walking in the street and you see someone having a heart attack and there's so many people around, they'll just assume that, hey, someone is already helping him, or he's getting help already. But if it was just you walking in that street and you see someone having a heart attack, obviously you're gonna jump and help, which is that bystander effect to say, hey, ops is invisible until it isn't, basically does not reveal itself until you start having problems, which is one of those things that you ultimately notice once those problems arise. Is it clients leaving, or ultimately just losing bleeding money simply because it's not tracked, and saying, hey, great operations feel like nothing, but that is the trap. So because it's not on fire, it doesn't, founders assume it's okay, but backend chaos is silent entropy, slow decay that compounds. So ultimately my personal belief is that everything compounds, and I'm super bullish on this to say, hey, if your backend infrastructure is not set up properly, it may not hurt you today, it may not hurt you tomorrow, it may not hurt you in the year, but ultimately long term that is going to compound, and that compounding effect is ultimately going to leave your business to dry out. And ultimately we want to be the people that ultimately come in, build backend infrastructure that stops that leak within the business currently today, and ultimately builds the future or the next generation of that business. But hey, we're building Killer Chaos OS to make sure those issues are visible before they wreck things, ultimately with our predictive analysis tool that we're actively building out, and saying, hey, we want to come in and we want to build the infrastructure layer that ultimately fuels growth for the business by using inversion thinking, basically asking the questions of what are the things that are stopping this business growing in the long run, and how can we actively plug in those holes so that it does not leak over time, basically making sure that the business is not bleeding money in the long term. But hey, predictive alerts, automation, role clarity, not when it's urgent but when it's calm, because that is the best time to solve this. When everything seems fine, that's when you need to solve it, and it doesn't become apparent until it is a headache within itself. You're getting 100, 200 clients, they all want a piece of you, but ultimately for them to have a piece of you, you need to have a solid backend infrastructure. But you don't realize it until you actively feel that pain, and that pain is urgent. Then you say, hey, we need to actively solve for this. So we're actively just building the backend infrastructure, but hopefully what we're aiming to do is build the next generation of the infrastructure layer for backend operations. So that is the ultimate goal for what it is that we're actively building, but also keeping into mind that inversion is my default operating mode. Like I said, instead of asking what would make this work faster, I rather ask what would completely break the system in 6 months, and that ultimately goes against everything that most people speak about. Most people say, hey, let's focus on growth. How can we grow? How can we actively spend more money, do all these things? But what if that is not solving your problem? What if spending more money on ads is actively not growing your business because people still keep leaving, and you're spending more to obtain new people, but people keep leaving, so your churn rate is pretty high, and you're actively not bringing in more people over the long time period? And then just basically understanding that, hey, this is simply just down to ops breaking. We need to ultimately make sure that we're also ultimately catering for that. But that's why we are designing a system that flags early friction before the client's churn, saying, hey, what are the friction points within the onboarding process, workflows, or whatever the process is, that specific process. What are the pain points or the friction points that ultimately arise as we scale this up, and then actively predicting for that so that we can flag it and say, hey, we need to actively just understand that in this specific department, this is going to cause, pain in the long run, and it's leading to client churn. Clients are leaving because of XYZ, and then ultimately gathering that data and using it to better refine for the clients that we're actively working with, and saying, hey, standardizes back-end workflows so no one becomes a bottleneck, making sure that, hey, within your team structure, we need to make sure that no one within your organization is becoming a bottleneck, is causing you to slow down within your business, because you move as fast as your constraints, and your constraints, you don't want to move as fast as that, because that slows you down. So you ultimately want to solve all your constraints. That ultimately allows you to just build more agile and tactically into the future. That ultimately allows you to solve these operational issues that you may have, and that solely just comes from having this system that we're actively building and making sure that we're using inversion thinking to say, hey, this is how we can actively stop this. And we're thinking about this in first principles as well, by also saying, hey, structure ops that don't collapse under success, because most ops or most businesses don't break unless it's under load. Also similar to testing products, for example, they don't ultimately break until you test them to their stress point, and then when you test them to their stress point, that's when they ultimately break. So it's just finding that break point, and then ultimately just understanding that, hey, this is where we need to ultimately just understand that, hey, we need to be catering for this. But I won't lie, one of the most important things that I've realized as well is that ops is an invisible layer. A lot of people don't understand, or they don't take it as serious until it actually happens. And that is one friction point that we've also just been deep in the trenches trying to learn how to communicate better, and also just make sure that we're actively providing as much value as we possibly can, because into the future it's more so of who gets it, and we want to make sure that we're doing it right. But in order to do that, we need to make sure that we're just deep in the trenches, building these videos, making these videos, refining our feedback loops as well, making sure that we're learning as much as we possibly can, because most founders wait until it's painful. And this is the worst part, to say, hey, you're gonna actively go to the doctor when your tooth is aching, not when your tooth is fine, and that's okay. But actively saying, hey, I'm not waiting, I'm building from first principles, making sure that, hey, business is an engine, ops are the oil, and then ultimately you don't wait for smoke before checking the pressure. Ultimately making sure that we're actively building these predictive analysis tools that ultimately allows our business clients, the clients that we're working with, to ultimately understand that, hey, this is what's going to happen if XYZ does not get done. This is how we're going to build it out, and make sure that this machine is going to be scalable into the future when you have, say, 100, 200, 300,000 clients, that it will still serve or still function the same way under load than it would right now when it basically has less load. So ultimately just understanding that and asking how can we actively just build for the future, I think is ultimately super important. But this also just comes through having my final thought, which is growth hides dysfunction. In as much as you may be growing, there may be those slow compounding effects that are ultimately driving these big breaks that may happen, and it may seem like a singular point of failure, but usually most of the case it's not. It comes from a long compounding effect that comes, and we ultimately just want to build around that and stop that in its core. But through that, until the system can't keep up, making sure that, hey, this works, this works until the system can't keep up. And by the time most founders realize it, they're hiring expensive operators to fix what they've ignored for 18 months. So basically calculating, hey, if you're losing $2,000 per month simply just on ops, and that is spread across 18 months, you just multiply those two, and then you ultimately get a number, and you say, hey, we've been losing so much revenue, what is going on? And you ultimately just need to be able to understand this. But hey, that's why we're actively flipping the script. We're building back end first, thinking in reverse, and then designing for the fires before they even start, which is the main mission for Killer Chaos OS, to just make sure that we're actively just hitting the nail in the wall and making sure that we're providing as much value as we possibly can. But through this, we need to make sure that we're actively just building the moats that ultimately drives this level of success for our clients. But in order to do this, we need to understand that, hey, most cases, this doesn't become apparent until it is detrimental to the business and they face that pain in that present moment in time. But ultimately making sure that, hey, if they face that pain, we are more than well equipped to be able to solve their problems and build a system that ultimately, allows them to use in the next 5-10 years, but just ultimately just refine it with oil and then ultimately scale that infrastructure by ultimately solving what is stopping their growth. But I think this is super important because you can only drive, the brick and mortar way for so long and before you have to switch over, and making that switch over process super easy and seamless is also super important. And this is something that we're actively just going to be going deep in and just solely just understanding, and we're going to be scaling into the future. And I'm super excited to just keep on making videos like this, keep on understanding why at least I've found why founders ignore operations until it's too late, and ultimately just getting to create more backend systems and ultimately create more value. I think that would be an exciting future. Like I always say, reshaping industries, also just inspiring millions of people. I think that would be a future worth getting excited to, and I'm super super excited to just keep on building the future of Killer Chaos OS. If you guys have any questions from this video, make sure to leave a comment. Make sure to also just follow me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram if you guys want to connect as well, and I will see you guys in the next video.